I taught here for 30 years, was in EMS here on the island for 30 years, and now I'm doing a news website.
That's really exciting.
I'm Bobby Welke. I live here seasonally since I retired, but I've been coming up here my whole life. My family's been coming up here since the 30s, so. And I'm part of the Historical Society Board.
Sure. My name is Usha Yoruba. I'm Michael's girlfriend, so I've heard a lot about that all the time.
So how many times have you heard this already?
I've heard it in bits and pieces,
I've
but I haven't tried to
most
get the
of
whole thing.
I'm Jean Neal. We visit the island every summer. This is our 6th year. I come with we come with a family, 4 generations. My parents, me, my kids, and my grandkids. So, and we visited the museum, and we know some of the history of the island. So we're interested.
Oh, that's great.
Todd, I'm with Jean here. Just come up for because it's a beautiful place, and I like the history. It's really interesting.
Slipping here right beside you, Tim. I think that's what I'm looking at from the back of the head. Okay.
I just came because it sounded really interesting.
Okay.
We're finishing the introductions.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure.
Even an interactive.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we're here because Bruce has a house, 2 houses on the island. We've been coming for years to visit him. But I'm a retired history teacher, and actually at some point I was teaching freshmen a long time ago, Michigan history, and the Strang was part of the history.
Oh, that's great.
I'm Karen's husband, John. We've been visiting Bruce since 1980s, really, virtually every year. Really appreciated their generosity. And but I'm a retired medical doctor from Mount Pleasant, Michigan, where we met Bruce. And I've never really felt particularly sympathetic towards James Strang. So somehow when he got assassinated, it just didn't feel that bad to me, even though I'm very much opposed to capital punishment.
I'm telling your whole life history.
Hi, I'm Bruce Allen. We've been here most summers for the last 40 years, so like the place.
My name is Phil O'Connor. I've been coming here since the mid-90s with my wife and myself, and I moved here about 3 years ago.
Oh my gosh. I want to hop back. Yeah.
Oh, Beth Welke, also been up here all my life. That's my father, I have family that lived here, and an aunt that was born and raised here.
Anyone else? Well, anyway, I appreciate y'all having me here. This is my first time on Beaver Island. This is sort of an unplanned trip, but we were in Ann Arbor and we wanted to so we both had Friday off. We wanted to go somewhere for the long weekend, and kind of found ourselves here. And I emailed Lori and I said, hey, I'm going to be here. Do you want to get lunch? And she said, will you come do a little talk? So I'll keep this pretty informal. I don't know if there's anything you want to say or before we
Well, we'll let these people come in. We're kind of standing room now, but you're welcome to come stand over.
You want us to just pull some chairs in and make another row?
Yeah, but I don't know if there's any more out there.
Oh, there's just one.
Let's roll them right across the way. What got you interested in King Strang?
That's a story. We can
Switch chairs.
I just have to say I'm really baffled that people are here really close to talk about James.
Hey, you came to the right place to give
I came to the right place. Anywhere else on earth would not get this level of attendance.
Are you surprised considering this is
I actually going around Beaver Island, I sort of expected it would feel like very Mormon branded and it's very Irish branded. Like there's a lot of like everything here sort of seems like Irish related. So I didn't expect that people were quite as tuned in or interested in Strang history. I guess it seems like there's sort of a wide range of kind of experiences here. So for some folks, who like don't know much about Strang, will go in. I can go into a little bit of an arc of what happened. For folks who are a little bit more seasoned, I hope there are some news sources. I don't have like a lengthy formal talk written up. We do have a little handout with some fun sources on Strang. If you have it, or if you're able to get a copy or see a copy, that's great. If you don't, maybe like it'll be okay.
I could print more after we're done.
Laura, did you want to do anything?
Yeah, we've got a couple of elderly ladies coming. Let's save those 2 chairs for them. This is quite the turnout.
It's a shocker.
Come on in here. You can stand on this side or on the side of the rooms. I'll just stand in the
This was your thesis defense?
This is my thesis, yeah.
Do you have the spirit crowd for that?
I had my thesis presentation got canceled for COVID, but I think I could have gotten 5 or 6 friends who are willing to kind of like tune out and eat dinner and watch, and besides that, I don't think anyone was gonna show up, so I'm happy. I think while folks are coming in, I'd be curious, like,
I'm fine.
what do people here feel like they know about Strang? Is there anyone here who feels like you've like really been able to dive into it, or has been interested? If you've been interested for a while, or the folks here where like Strang is kind of brand new to you? What's sort of the?
Well, it's kind of the politics of the island. It sounds like, if the stories I hear are right, he came with his followers and kind of pushed everybody else off. And then 2 of his followers did him in just across the street here.
Yeah, that's right. The push everyone else off is kind of is a subject of debate, but the followers did him in part is, yeah, pretty true.
You know, when the followers were taken off on the USS Michigan that just happened to be here?
Yeah.
Is that the first conspiracy theory?
Well, there are deeper stories for the USS Michigan, and the bigger drama was that his killers were taken off in the USS Michigan so that they wouldn't get. Oh, this is very.
Can hear you?
Yes, of course. The killers were also taken off in the USS Michigan so they wouldn't get attacked.
He wasn't taken off, it was the killers.
The killers.
That's what I understood. Yeah.
The killers and then some of the followers were sort of invited off.
But then the killers were never found guilty, or?
They were found guilty, and then they spent, I think, like half a day in jail. Yeah, it was a good time. Like if you were gonna kill someone in, you know, upstate Michigan in the 1850s, a Mormon would kind of be the person to. Yeah, it was not particularly sympathetic. All right, Laura, ready to kick things off?
We're ready. You've already introduced yourself, though.
I already introduced myself. Yeah, I can start telling you how I came to Strang. I was an undergrad at Yale. I was always sort of interested in the Mormons, didn't know a ton about it besides having read a couple of books, and discovered that Yale had this huge archive of Strang papers that no one, at least for a while, had really dug through. I'm not sure why they were there. I think it wasn't his family, but sort of whoever had them before felt kind of like icky about giving them to BYU since there was so much tension, and I think no one else really wanted papers on James Strang, so they sat there for a while. Wrote my sort of senior thesis in college on Strang, and the Strang age, and in particular, what government looked like on Beaver Island. Also got a chance to look at some sort of weirder archives out at BYU and Provo, and then at the LDS Church, and now I am here on Beaver Island. This was not totally planned. We were going to try and do a weekend trip somewhere up north, and the Beaver Island Lodge had very competitive rates. So I emailed Lori and said, like, hey, I'll be here. And she said I should give a talk. I can just sort of start out by laying my cards on the table. I'm not Mormon. I'm Jewish. My general view, and I'm not totally sure what's right, is that Strang probably was not appointed by Joseph Smith to lead the church. It seems like that probably didn't happen for a bunch of reasons. If folks have looked at the letter of appointment, I think the thing that like probably non-Mormon scholars are most curious about is that Strang sort of claims to receive this letter from Smith that said like, hey, I want to let you know I'm going to die in about a week and you'll be in charge. I think for Mormon scholars, they typically kind of dispute the accuracy of it. There's some weird stuff with the postmark which might work, and the handwriting's complicated, and the signature's a little messy. I think for non-Mormon scholars, they typically are saying, we don't totally buy that Smith knew that he was about to die a few days before he was killed by a mob. So I, probably don't believe that Strang was actually sort of the person who was supposed to be in charge there. But I also think that like the story we often tell about Strang, the Strangites, is a little bit simpler and a little bit kind of like funnier than it actually was. again, I'm not sure sort of what your backgrounds look like. I think sort of in a nutshell, the typical like Michigan history story is that Strang was this sort of weird dude who came out with like a couple thousand followers to Beaver Island because it sort of seemed like the place to go. That he ran this little cult on the island that was kind of functionally a kingdom. They did these sort of silly rituals, and he had a coronation with a crown, and then things didn't go so well, his followers are upset, and like everyone left. And the Mormon story is that, well, Strang was sort of like a kind of medium level person in the church. He faked this like letter that was supposedly from Smith that wasn't totally accurate, and then Brigham Young was like, hey, I'm actually in charge, and then everyone said, okay, that's fine, that's true. I think sort of the case that I want to make today, or the thing that I want to talk through, is both that Strang was actually a really serious contender for leadership of the church, that we know that, you know, well, I think some Mormon scholars claim that by like 1846, everything was cleared up, that Brigham Young was focused on like other things. We know that Young was sending functionally missionaries out to Strangite churches to yell at people, like at the end of their sermons and try and debate them, that he was like writing 4- and 5-page letters to Strang and to churches, threatening them, saying like, I want you to know that I'm actually in charge, while he was also trying to like literally fight the US Army. And that as much as like the Strangite rituals were sort of weird and quirky, like a lot of things in like the 1850s were weird and quirky, he actually had kind of a functioning government here, and a functioning government that wasn't like totally a kingdom, that had, you know, like clearly, so, like where he clearly had some authority, but where also there were like real systems of government, where there were real sort of courts and trials and laws and systems of punishment, where people could like actually did have some rights. And that the story we tell about kind of the Strangites leaving, and you know, Strang got shot, and that was kind of unfortunate, but it was because a couple of followers really angry at them, is partially true, but the bigger truth was that Strang and the Strangites there were victims of religious persecution. And it wasn't because they were like fringe Mormons, right? There were not, at least as far as I know, there were not a lot of people who were non-Strangites around here at the time who were like, my issue with Strang is that I actually think Brigham Young is in charge of the Mormon church. Their issue was that he wasn't a mainstream Christian, and that anyone who wasn't a mainstream Christian in this area at that time was subject to like intense persecution. And we know that, you know, as much as the actual killings weren't, like the killing of Strang was not actually government orchestrated, right? It was done by two people who were upset about some weird stuff that we can go into a little bit later. You know, he was walking onto a dock where he was about to get harassed by the captain of the USS Michigan, who like was upset that he was stealing fish, but was clearly more upset that he was a Mormon. And that there was no one else you could have killed up here where their killers would be convicted, and then broken out of jail, and then a parade would be thrown, and then they'd be sentenced to a fine and like half a day in jail. And that what happened here on this island afterwards, right, like settlement and like, and, you know, an intense and impressive Irish community, and like sort of like, you know, these restaurants we have, the historical society and all that blossoming, is also the result of what was functionally like an attempted extermination of a religion. That, you know, a mob came in after Strang was killed, and they threatened people. They said, we're going to burn all of your religious buildings down and some of your homes. They said, like, they had guns, and they said, you have to leave this island. Like, there are disputing accounts of exactly what happened, but it was not like, oh no, these Strangites are kind of wacky, and now that Strang is gone, they don't know what's going to happen. But it was like an anti-Mormon mob that came in and threatened them with, like, religious persecution. And that all of these folks who had traveled from the East Coast or wherever and wound up on this little island in the middle of nowhere, Michigan, were then kind of left to like figure their stuff out because the government hated Mormons. And because like if you were a Mormon living up in northern Michigan in the 1850s, you functionally didn't have a lot of rights. And that we should look at the history of Strang. Again, like we can talk about the quirkiness, we can talk about the funny stuff, and like it's a little bit weird that Strang was coronated, like had an actual coronation, right? That's a little bit strange. Like it's a little bit weird that he had like an order of the Illuminati, or that he thought he was like king of the universe. Like that's definitely like kind of funny, but also that we should look at Strang in a kind of nasty historical context. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and what I wanted to talk through today. I'm happy to keep this like pretty interactive. There are a lot of parts of Strang's life, yeah.
Well, if you go down to Cable's Creek, there's a sign about Cable getting pushed out of town by the Mormons. So when they came, it sounds like they were, they were not particularly pleasant people either, and were taking over the island almost by force.
Yeah, and I think that is the part that I have not gotten perfect sources on. And that seems a little bit disputed. There are sources from Gentiles who lived on the island, so folks who never converted, but who sort of lived alongside and saw Strang, and said that sort of functionally the Strangites were peaceful. That they came in, they built structures, that some people say they treated the Native Americans on the island better than the folks on Mackinac had. And then there are others that say that the Strangites pushed folks out. I do think probably there are sort of separate questions, right, between like, what is it okay for the Strangites to do? Like, obviously, like, I as a person, like, I'm not a Strangite. Like, there are a lot of things that they believed and that they did that I am not gonna do. And also, what's it okay for our government to do? And like, is it really true that, like, it was bad that the Mormons stole fish. Like, you shouldn't steal fish, like, that's a bad thing. And also, is the reason why they were getting attacked and persecuted because they stole fish from other islands? Or is the reason why that they were Mormons who came up to a town, like an area that was not particularly welcoming of them? And I think you can kind of hold those two things as like both pretty true at the same time. Yeah.
And say that Michigan Lawyers Guild wrote an article basically claiming that there were national politics involved.
Yeah.
In terms of the Strangites were Democrats and they had kind of gerrymandered the island to vote Democratic, and there was a major election coming, presidential election coming up. And so that leans towards the conspiratorial theory that the USS Michigan was not here by accident, and so that's intriguing advice.
I think it's interesting, and I think, like, again, Strang was like really, like, I mean, we can sort of talk more about sort of his childhood. Like, Strang was someone who really liked the idea of having political influence beyond his church. And like, you can sort of say, well, like, he ran for state legislature, he won, he served a couple of terms, it's not clear that he like did anything. Like, he was super involved in, like, he clearly did not actually care who would become president, but he cared that, like, he could in theory affect who could become president. And so, like, he was playing politics in a real way. I do think that also, like, the other case we can make is that, you know, there are sort of conspiracy theories that we can come up with, there are things that we can say, well, this might or might not be true. I don't think it's in dispute that the folks who actually, like, the mob that came and burned the Mormon tabernacle down on the island was doing it because they hated Mormons. Like, they weren't subtle about it, right? This is not like a implicit bias type thing where we're like, well, maybe like they grew up and they didn't know that Mormons were different. Like, they were very clear that one of the reasons, and maybe the main reason why they didn't like Strangites was because they didn't like Mormons, and that was like kind of a probably pretty common feeling that you would have in the 1850s if you were not a Mormon. Like, I think that was standard. But yeah, I think the question of whether the Michigan was there to like bug him, because like it had been there to bug him before, and like he thought it was like, it kind of played into his narrative, and he thought it was kind of fun, or was it there to like facilitate the killing? I don't know. My gut sense is that and we can talk more about sort of why the killers killed him. I don't actually think there was sort of a mastermind plot behind it. I think they were just kind of like pissed off, and the way you'd be pissed off if you lived on an island and there was a king, and the king was like pretty weird and like had dress codes and like with people, like, and it's not a crazy thing to be a little bit, you know, miffed there. Yeah.
Do you think there was economic interest because they didn't have titles to land, and here you get all these nice houses and cleared farmsteads?
You know, I'm not sure. I think the sort of argument against economic interest is that the Mormons were not particularly great at like cultivating the land. That like if you look at sort of the history, like there's no sort of biological reason why the Irish came in and then suddenly like Beaver Island was the place to go for fisheries. Like I think the reason was because the Mormons, who like did not come from Lake Michigan, didn't quite know how to fish. I mean, I think that there's always an economic thing at play. I think the bigger question though is like, who do we feel like we have license to kick out for economic reasons, right? Like there are a million places in Michigan where you can build really nice farms, and there are only some where if you go and you say, hey, you all are leaving and we're burning down your house, and also we're just gonna like throw you in random places, good luck, where no one says anything bad about it, and people host a parade for you. Like, I think that is probably the line there. And I don't want it to sound like, again, I think Strang was weird. Like, I think Strang was a weird dude. So I wanted it to sound like I think the Strangites were like perfectly normal, reasonable forms of government, that they should have stayed here forever. But also, it's more complicated than just kind of a cult hanging out. So I think if anyone has, I don't know how many folks sort of have this set of papers here. I will admit that I sort of threw this together in about 20 minutes, but these are this is my kind of greatest hit set of sources on James Strang. I'll also read them out. One of the sort of weirdest and most fun sources that I found on Strang, and I don't know if anyone here has seen this before, was that starting when he was, I think, 17 and going until just before he was baptized by Joseph Smith, Strang kept this very strange diary. He was sort of like an angsty teenager who lived in middle of nowhere, upstate New York. Kind of felt like everyone thought he was dumb, which some people dispute, but he like very strongly believed. Was like became a postmaster and a lawyer and like briefly a preacher and like a teacher, but a very bad teacher who did not like his students very much, and like really hated the winter, and was just like figuring his stuff out. I think this is really the last time when we see a version of Strang that kind of didn't know that everything he was about to write was going to get like looked at by someone, and sort of the last like set of moments where I think you can sort of see an authentic version of him. If you look at the sort of first page here, and again, you're not going to like miss stuff if you can't see it, you will see that James Strang actually wrote, I'd say about 5 to 10% of the diary in cipher. He made this sort of strange little code for himself that I don't think was a particularly complicated cipher. His great-grandson, I'm going to say, was a guy named Mark Strang who lived out in California in the 1950s, and as a retirement project decided, I want to translate like great-grandpa's cipher. And so managed to do that, gave that to Yale, and everyone was like, cool, this is fine, we're not, it's like you're decoding James Strang's diary, we're not going to like dig into this too deep. But you can find some really fun stuff. So if you flip to the next page, February 19th, 1832, this would have been, I'm going to say, when he was 18, almost 19. You can kind of get a sense of like where Strang is coming from and why he's doing this. I'm sorry I have not made more improvement in preparing for my great designs of revolutionizing government of countries than I have. And he's 18 and living in like upstate New York and doesn't know anyone. But yet I feel as if I have gained some. I am sometimes almost discouraged as to the great matters that have long occupied my mind, and have this winter seriously thought of marrying a young lady of moderate fortune and settling in private life. But the dreams of empire are so thoroughly imprinted in my mind as to not easily be erased. Like, he was striving for something. And so I do think for folks who are making the case that, like, Strang was kind of just hanging out, and then, like, suddenly Joseph Smith said, you're the guy, and there's sort of no pre-planning there, like, he's plodding a little bit. 1832, on his birthday, again, the in brackets means that it was in cipher and is now translated. I'm 19 years old, and yet no more than a common farmer. 'Tis too bad. I ought to have been a member of the assembly or a brigadier general before this time if I am ever to rival Caesar or Napoleon, which I have sworn to. Like, kind of the same dude, right? Like, this is someone where if you look at, like, if you read this, and then I said, like, this guy's gonna start a kingdom on an island in Michigan, you'd be like, that's weird, but you wouldn't be like shocked, right? You wouldn't be like totally, completely surprised. A little bit later, his next birthday. This is my birthday. I arise and hope bright prospects are before me, but all depends upon most untiring exertion. 20 years of my life have already passed, and what have I done? What have I done? Nothing but commenced doing. Like, he's a teacher, he's hanging out, he's a teacher, and he's writing, like, these sort of grand designs. And so, I do think that, like, oftentimes we see scholarship on Strang that tries to kind of play 8D chess with the reasons why he did the things that he did in Michigan. Like, why was he calling attention to himself by running for state legislature when, like, he could have just hung out here and it didn't seem like he did anything in the state legislature? Why would he, like, get a kingdom on an island when it seems like he could like really lay low and say, I am in charge of my version of the Mormon church? Like, why would he actually, like, maybe, possibly, we don't know, but some people say forge this letter of appointment when, like, he was rising up the ranks, and like he really could have probably gone to Brigham Young and been like, can I be your number 2? And maybe you're a Strangite and you believe it's all sort of destined, which is like which is not an unfair thing to believe. But like, maybe instead of saying that like this is all part of like a weird, like very complicated plot by Strang to like that landed him here and would have taken him somewhere else, like maybe the guy who wrote when he was 18 that he wanted to become Napoleon, like also wanted to be an elected official and a king, right? Like maybe this is not the world's most complicated sort of like story, but that actually like Strang was someone who was like super ambitious and like did his stuff and wound up here. We do have sources from his childhood saying that he writes in his diary a lot about how he was sort of stupid and how everyone thought he was dumb and how like he couldn't get through school. We have sources from his sister and from some of his friends who said that like he was actually very bright, that he like worked so hard he would make himself sick, that he was like academically talented and inclined. So who knows on all of that. But I do think that like without sort of doing too deep of a psychological profile, that some of that background of this is not just a guy who's like wandering out to Michigan saying like, what do I want to do? That's valuable. Yeah.
And wasn't it true he also wrote Queen Victoria and proposed marriage?
I don't know about that. I've heard that that's true, but I don't know. It wouldn't be shocking. It seems he wrote a lot about, he sort of fell in love with a woman, he fell out of love with a woman, and then he was like wrote like extensive stuff about how he felt like his strategy was to marry someone very rich. And again, like 19-year-old teacher in upstate New York like knew these like billionaire like princesses or whatever who were trying to like marry him, but like decided that sort of because like he wanted to be the one who was in charge. Again, the sort of story of that kind, like his kind of entrance into the Mormon Church, in case it's sort of hasn't come up for you before, is that he had a friend who was like, hey, have you heard of Joseph Smith? And he was like, nope. And then the friend was like, what are you doing? And Strang was like, nothing. Like I hate teaching these kids. And then they like took him, heard Joseph Smith preach, and then got baptized and was like, I'm all in, I'm going to run a stake in Wisconsin. There's a lot of like drama around the succession crisis. Yeah.
I mean, as a doctor, it brings to mind delusions of grandeur and mental illness. But then, wasn't Joseph Smith kind of also subject to some of these same grandiosity? And it almost seems like the culture at the time was fostering that sort of behavior.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question really is like, I don't know, did anyone here keep a diary when they were like an early teen? Like, probably wrote some dumb shit in that diary, right? Like, probably was not like, I have a life, I'm a very measured, responsible person who's not dealing with my own hormones. Like, there's probably a lot of stuff happening there. I mean, I think like, it's not a crazy thing to say, well, this guy formed a kingdom on an island in Michigan, like he's having some delusions of grandeur. Like I don't think that's like out of bounds to assume that that's true. But I also think that like, at least from my reading of it, and again, I don't know, it is strange. I found a lot of letters from his family members to sort of his sisters. I think there's something that like his mother might have dictated to folks who either to his kids or folks who lived on the island afterwards, trying to describe him. And no one seemed to have a handle on him. They would sort of like, I think we might have something in here, but people would write to his sisters who he said he was close to, and they'd be like, yeah, he was very smart and bright and studied very hard, and he seemed like perfectly normal and nice, and then he went off to Michigan and like, ooh, like I don't know what happened there. So I don't know. I think that I also read a little bit of it as someone who like was terribly, terribly sick as a child, who had a father who just seemed like a little bit off his, and who like, I think spent a lot of his early teenage years like really miserable and alone and bored, and like had some stuff going on. And so the idea of being like 18, going through all that, you're living in really like a, just like a not, like it's not fun to live in upstate New York in the 1830s, right? Like that's not the place to be. And like you're writing a diary that says, I will do literally anything to get out of here. Like I don't think you have to be crazy to do that. I also think that that childhood upbringing might then push you in a direction where you're pretty likely to like want to become king of everywhere. But I think we can sort of fold both those things as probably true. But yeah, I again, like you have to be a little bit out there, right? Like it's not, if you're like totally stable and maybe you're not gonna do all this. The big sort of the most documented like period in Strang's life on the sort of historical side was the succession crisis of 1844. There's a lot of stuff on that, but essentially Joseph Smith dies. He's killed by an anti-Mormon mob because again, it's not a super fun time to like be a Mormon anywhere. Not that it's like a great time to be a Mormon now either. And the church says, well, like, oh crap, what do we do? And Brigham Young says, well, I sort of have a series of like, he's like, I kind of have this essentially sort of a case that says that, well, like, Smith never said you're in charge, like, I'm kind of the natural person, I'm like, it kind of makes sense that I'd be the person who runs this, like, I'm already senior up in the church, and like, I might actually not be a prophet, but I could be the president of the church, like, why don't we make this happen? And then Strang comes, and he says, hey guys, I want to let you know that I had this letter. And the letter was written by Joseph Smith to me. And he never told anyone else about it, because it was to me personally. And the letter is about 4 pages long, and essentially says, I had this vision, I went on a hill, people told me, like, you're about to die, you need to appoint a successor, and the successor is James Strang. We have a copy, like the letter exists at the archives at Yale, if we have a copy of the letter, you would think that it would be very easy to tell, like, who was telling the truth and who wasn't. The challenge was that Smith almost never wrote his own stuff. He would have this sort of like really just wide rotation of scribes who wrote in like different handwriting. He sometimes signed his letters. He sometimes had someone else sign on his behalf. And everyone involved in it, because the Mormons were like reasonably kind of petrified by everything else that was going on, was going to be like a Mormon who was very close to some senior leader in the church. So there's not good evidence on whether it was true or false. Someone did an extensive analysis and figured out the postmark was real on the letter. That could mean that Strang mailed it to himself. There was a claim that it wasn't written by Smith and Strang didn't write it, but instead one of Young's followers forged a letter from Smith and mailed it to Strang as a prank. And that Strang then believed it. I think that's probably not true. Like I think that seems like a lot of effort. But Strang's case was really compelling, right? Like, you are a Mormon in 1844, and like, was not a fun time to be a Mormon in 1843, right? And then Joseph Smith, who's like your actual prophet, gets shot and killed. And like, you are figuring out what to do. And the idea that like, not only would you have sort of given up probably everything else in your life so that you could be part of this like hyper-persecuted religious sect, but that now that religious sect doesn't have a clear leader, and the person who's in charge isn't even really saying they're a prophet, they're saying, well, it kind of makes natural sense for me to be in charge. That's like devastating, right? Like I would not, like can you imagine being a Mormon in the 1840s and not believing that the guy who's in charge of your church is like really ordained by God? And so when Strang comes in and said, actually, like, don't worry, this is all according to plan. Like, Joseph Smith knew this was going to happen, and like, God's talking to me now, and like, I'll make stuff happen. And he was like Smith, like, you know, Strang was like a pretty charismatic dude. People liked him. Like, he was cool. And like, if I were a Mormon back then, that would be the story that I wanted to believe, right? Like, I would really, really want Strang to be the person who's in charge. The official church claim is that they got together for a conference, and in that conference, there was like a lot of debate, and everyone was sort of torn, but Young was doing much better, and they were still debating, and they were sort of talking things through, and Strang saying some stuff, and this guy named Rigdon was saying some stuff, and then Young sort of transfigured into Joseph Smith, like his face started to look like Joseph Smith, and he started to sound like Joseph Smith, and everyone was like, this is the dude. The Strangites, and also probably most non-Mormons, claim that didn't happen. And then the Mormon narrative afterwards is essentially like, it's finished, Strang was never that serious of a contender, like he went off and did his own thing, it's not really a part of Mormon history. I think the case that I want to make is that it's probably, like again, I don't actually know who, if anyone, Joseph Smith wanted to be in charge. But that, at least for a period, probably from after that conference for the next year or two, it wasn't immediately clear who would lead the church, and that Strang was someone who both Young and other kind of neutral parties thought had a real shot. I think the best case for that is there were a handful of folks in the church who, again, I can't go into their heads, but who seemed kind of scummy, who seemed a little bit like they were sort of in the Mormon church because they wanted to be really powerful, and they weren't necessarily true believers, who had bounced from leader to leader to leader because they saw that everything was reshuffling, and they were like, oh, we want to go for the person who we think has the most likelihood of actually sort of getting on through. And that those folks, well, you might not believe that they actually know who, Smith had intended to appoint. They actually were pretty good, clear barometers of who had a shot at moving forward. And that church narrative, James Strang is whatever, he's this kind of kooky guy, probably isn't so true if there's a set of people who are not true believers, but really just trying to get senior leadership roles in the church, who are actively trying to court Strang. So if we look at the next page, if you see that starts with, do you intend to? I think John C. Bennett is probably the best example. He was a senior dude in the church. He designed most of the Mormon buildings in Nauvoo where they were sort of originally lived. He served as mayor for a while. He started a university. He kind of made the Mormon Chamber of Commerce. He started sort of a social club. And was also kind of a scummy dude. It seems like he sexually assaulted someone who was in the church and then forced her to get an abortion, got excommunicated from the church for adultery, not a great guy, but was really trying to get back into the good graces of the Mormons. And so wrote Strang these letters that were do you intend to have me in my original place in the first presidency as one of your counselors? I'm willing to acknowledge and sustain you as president, chief, first in all things, with Elder George J. Adams as an equal counselor, but I am not willing now, nor will I ever be, to yield supremacy to ignorant men simply because they were reputed pious. No one doubts your talent, and let me repeat again, have your chief men vigorous, energetic, and intellectual. Napoleon's counselors were generals and statesmen, and they made him great, though he was like yourself, great himself, right? If you knew Strang, you knew that the Napoleon comparison was pretty good. That seeing letters from relatively senior folks in the Mormon church who probably were not the greatest people, but who had a real shot of assuming leadership in any wing, saying, I'm going to say you're in charge, but only in this letter and kind of only if you say you're a senior leader, that's compelling, right? Again, from Bennett, today, on the next page, today I received the enclosed letters from E. Robinson, Reagan's first counselor in the first presidency, and Colonel Hinkle, one of Ringland's grand counselor, soliciting me to attend their conference, for I have something to do in that kingdom, Rigdon's. Now I rather think not, I shall unite with you or with none. That's a little bit of a way of saying, hey, I have other offers, I think you're in charge, but I don't think I shall unite with you or with none actually means I shall unite with you or with none. I think it means I'm willing to say I'll unite with you or with none. And also, the clock's ticking, do you want to make me in charge? Then John Page was also, a senior, he was a member of the Quorum of 12, which was, yeah.
Well, I just thought, so you were talking earlier about how there were people who were probably just, people who wanted power in the church. Yeah. And he had all these writings when he was younger, before he was, a Mormon, about, wanting to be in power and stuff. And I know, most churches, but also the Mormon church doesn't have the greatest track record with child marriages and that kind of corrupt stuff. So do you think he was a true believer, or do you think there's a chance that he was just in it for power?
Strang, you mean?
Yeah, sorry.
It's hard to put myself in his head. I think that, again, the short answer is I don't know. I I would say that having read a lot of Strang's writings, I think for him, because being a Strangite was so like, and the word Strangite is like currently people who are members of the sort of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who believe that Strang was the descendant wouldn't want to call themselves Strangites because they would say that like, we're actually, no, we're just remember the real church, and there's some Brighamites on the side that like believe in other stuff, but like we're just sort of like the church that started with Joseph Smith. But I think that like if you believe in sort of like Mormonism as the Strangites defined it, one of the big things you believe is that like James Strang was a prophet who was ordained by God and is now getting crowned like essentially king of the universe. And so for Strang, I think the idea of like, I don't know whether he believes in like the Joseph Smith side of things, but I think that like he seems like someone who wouldn't be that hard to convince. Like it wouldn't be that hard to convince him that he was king. Like I think that like his sort of personality was suited to believe, like he clearly really believed in himself. And because like Strang as a person was such a central part of being a Strangite on Beaver Island, like I think he at least believed in that part. I don't know on the other stuff. It's hard to. I think there's a case for it and against it probably. But yeah, so John Page, like member of the Quorum of the 12, which means he was sort of one of the top 12 people in the church alongside Smith, writes in this letter, and he goes, I therefore say in true sincerity of heart that I am thankful to the God of Israel in the name of Jesus Christ to say to you that I am fully persuaded by the word of the Lord and the spirit of the truth that you are the man to fill the place of Joseph Smith. Like, whoa, right? That is big. That is not a letter you write if you were a senior leader of the Mormon Church who could absolutely get appointed by Young to do kind of whatever you want, to someone who you think isn't necessarily going to be in charge of the church. And Page would come, and then he would leave the Strangite movement, and then he sort of, kind of had a thing, and like was upset, and there was some drama there afterwards. But like that stuff is real. And the final and sort of weirdest set of sources that I have never gotten the chance to really get my head around is that there is a letter from William Smith, and William Smith is Joseph Smith's son, who would later not become a Strangite, that was printed in one of Strang's papers. Lengthy letter that's sort of mostly kind of fluffy, but it starts with that. I also heard Joseph say that should the time ever come that Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball would lead the church, that they would lead it to hell. This was said in the hearing of Sister Emma Smith. The whole Smith family of the Joseph stock joined in sustaining J.J. Strang. It is to be remembered that soon after Joseph and Hiram's death, Brother Green died, and he was heard by numerous individuals to say that Joseph had appointed Strang. And then it's signed by like William Smith and a bunch of other kids and Lucy Smith, who I think, right, like, that's real. Again, there's some, like this was printed in a Beaver Island newspaper, so we don't have like an original record from the Smiths like writing this to Strang, and yet there's also a pretty strong case that this wasn't totally forged, both because at least everything else I have not seen other obvious forgeries in the Beaver Island newspapers, and also because Smith would later become very anti-Strangite, probably knew that this was going to be one of these papers because they were getting circulated, and like Strang was using this as a tool, and said a lot of things that were like Strang is bad, but never quite said, I didn't say that. And then to go even further, again, these are all happening in 1844, 1845. I think the letter from the Smiths was in like sometime early 1846. That like the sort of ancient Mormon narrative is that Young was like, who was dealing with a lot of stuff, was essentially sort of all in on moving the church in other directions once the succession crisis was over. But that like the thing was decided, maybe Strang was a contender for a minute, but like we're powering through. And that actually Young was like very committed, like very worried about Strangites. And that like while he was, again, like sort of in active combat with the US government, he would send people to churches where either were Strangite churches or more often where Strangites were preaching, that were senior leaders in the church, whose job would be to just yell from the back, or try and see if they could get an unscheduled sermon afterwards, being like, this is wrong. Right? If you're a Mormon on an intense like missionary drive, are you going to do that if you're not worried about Strang? If you think he's sort of like a weird little like side case? And then we also have records of Brigham Young writing to churches that he thought might be Strangite reddening them. So we have this letter here that's actually written by, like physically written by Brigham Young. If you shall think proper to listen to the falseness of Mr. Strang, Brother Miller is instructed to cut you off from the church. We hope you will see your error and flee from it and save yourselves from the devil. Like, you don't write that letter to a church if you think everything is going great, right? You don't write that letter if, like, you think that the Strangites are dying out. You write that because you think that your authority is being, like, attacked. And that for Young and for Strang, the idea of kind of anti-Mormon mobs, right, the idea of people from the outside coming in and trying to attack them, is actually totally theologically sound. Right, I think one of the things we see a lot in Strang's speeches and in Young's too is that, like, if you were in a religion where Joseph Smith was, like, very much murdered, right, like was very much killed by a mob, and where, like, generally Mormons who are sort of true believers at the top of the faith are consistently attacked, one way of showing that you are, like, really someone who should be in charge is showing that you're getting attacked from the outside. And Mormons, I think, often, or at least at that time, would often kind of compare that to Christ, which is a reasonable comparison. It was, like, also a dude who was not completely popular in his own day. But for both Young and Strang, anytime anyone from within the church said, well, I believe in the Mormon stuff, but I don't know that you're in charge, that, like, really, really, really scared them. So before we get to a little bit of time with Brownland, I just wanted to sort of stop there and see if folks have questions or reactions or anything. I know there's a lot of, yeah.
What I think is interesting too is also, you know, one of the big disputes with Brigham Young and Strang was where were you leading the search, and Young was headed west, you know, and I think when you think that difference in strategy was partly where the real battle was between the two.
I wonder, so again, I'm not sure, and I'm not like I'm not really an expert on anything, but I'm especially not an expert on sort of Mormon history outside of Strang. I will say that there are some, I was talking to a researcher last year who had found letters either from, either from Smith or Young, I think they were from Young, to multiple governors of multiple states, including Rhode Island, saying, hey guys, like, shit's going down, like, would it be okay if we came and lived there? And like, at least in Rhode Island, the governor was like, we are very religiously tolerant, but also, like, not of you, no thank you, goodbye. And so, it seems like it's always historically easier and more convenient to paint everything you do as a strategy, right? Like, I think in our lives, like, I feel like in my life at least, I often like to, like, sort of pretend that, like, everything I'm doing is the result of a grand plan. And often you're just doing stuff, right? And so I don't totally, I'm not sure that I totally know whether even the move out west was, like, you know, like a grand plan, or whether it was just kind of what they had to do. I think for Strang, he didn't care. Like, I think he really didn't care. Like, I think Beaver Island seems cool. I think he really liked the nature, and like, there are like hundreds and hundreds of pages of Strang writing about, like, the beavers and other animals on Beaver Island. I think he liked the island, and I think he liked the fact that it was an island. But I don't think, like, I think if Young had said, well, you can be in charge, you just have to move out west, Strang would have been like, I heard, like, I lost it, I can be in charge, like, I'm all in. Yeah.
This is I don't know if this is just a myth, but there was a suggestion that the Strangites, the Mormons here on the island, were occasionally pirates, that they were wreckers. Did you ever run across anything like that?
Yeah, so we know that they definitely stole fish from the folks on Mackinac. It's not clear, the Strangite narrative is like, well, they started it, like, they kind of came up and, you know, like, we're trying to sort of screw with us, and so we stole their fish, just like a whatever. And it seems like they stole fishing boats. They also probably, it seems like they might have killed someone in the process of stealing fish or fishing boats, although that's not also obviously clear. And again, my sense was that, like, I think from sort of a theory perspective, like, I don't think they were like, I want to go and upset the locals. I also think if you find yourself in the middle of Lake Michigan and you don't know how to fish really well, like, you do some stuff. And I'm not saying this sounds like good, like no one, none of us here should go steal fish, but, like, it doesn't shock me that they did it. Yeah, but yes, short answer is yes, they did. Yeah, but I guess moving on in our last few minutes to life on Beaver Island itself, there's a fun story we can see on the next page about an enormous trial that sort of started with the 5th that involved Strang was put on trial in a courthouse in Beaver Island, but with a jury from outside the island, managed to, I think the Strang had brought something like 120 witnesses to the trial to claim that Strang had committed no crimes, and the prosecutor every time would go up to them and they would sort of ask them questions and then would say, well, do you believe that Strang's a prophet? And they'd be like, yeah. And then they'd be like, does he perform miracles? And they'd be like, yeah. And then they'd be like, well, if he asked you to, would you lie for him? And then I'll be like, yeah. And then they'd be like, are you lying for him now? And they'd be like, no, absolutely not. This also happens to be true. But Strang managed to get off. Managed to he won the trial because apparently he sort of got up in front of the jury, none of whom were Mormon, and compared himself to Christ and said that people who were persecuting him were like Pharisees, and that if you were a juror who voted against him, can you imagine being someone in the time of Christ, voting to kill Christ, a bad moment? And then they were and then the jurors were like, yeah, he seems kind of we don't know, maybe he did it, but he seems kind of a little bit divine. Which maybe it's just what happens if you spend that much time around Strang and you're on Beaver Island. I think the big myth, how many people here have heard the whole King of Beaver Island thing, or the whole coronation, you heard about a coronation, where the kind of common narrative is that Strang thought that he was like a king ruling over this part of the land, which I think is a little bit misguided. To be clear, Strang was pretty much in charge of Beaver Island, but that the way it was governed was a little bit less as a community with a king and more as it was sort of functionally almost a democracy, but where everyone there believed that they were living with someone who was prophetic. And so Strang spent a lot more time in nature and cataloging temperatures and the 9,000 types of trees or whatever that are on Beaver Island, and actually doing the governing. That he had a council of people who were in charge of it. There was some level of voting that we know about. Again, I don't think it was purely democratic. And that when we talk about Strang being crowned as a king, he actually wasn't crowning himself as king of Beaver Island. He was crowning himself as a divine king of the world. And so I think one way to think about this would be if you went to Vatican City, right? You wouldn't feel if the Pope said to do something, people in Vatican City are going to do something, right? But you wouldn't feel like you're in a kingdom. You'd be well, everyone here is a Catholic and they believe that the Pope's in charge, and so they're going to do that stuff. But also cardinals are voting, making decisions, and that that the Pope is not spending most of his time trying to figure out what do we do in Vatican City, and I think that is probably how Strang and his followers saw himself. So it's not that you could be anti-Strangite on Beaver Island, that would be a bad time if you were in the community, but also it's not it wasn't as sort of cult kingy as people seem to suggest. Yeah.
This all speculation, but it would seem if you were not a Mormon, that it was not feeling very democratic, or you were not going to be included in the picture, and that it was a threat if you were not Mormon, that your nets were going to be seized, or you'd be whipped, or any of these other things. So
yeah, so I think that there are some non-Mormons who were just vibe, who were just having a great time, and wrote letters afterwards being yeah, Strang was not any of that, but he was totally nice to me. There were some who said actually no, they were kind of rude. We don't have a ton of evidence that people were punished for being not Mormon. They would steal stuff from other islands too. I think the chances that if you were not a Strangite would steal stuff from you, yeah, that's definitely going to happen.
Was there a tax or a tithe that was imposed, as I've read some places, that everybody had to pay?
I'm not sure. People say that there might have been. What's not clear to me was whether they were forcing folks to tithe, or they were saying you tithe the city you live in right now in form of taxes. So I don't know what they were saying there. I think the bigger challenge was that it's less that Strang was going to come get you, right? It's less that Strang had a set of rules, but it's more if you were on Beaver Island right now, and everyone else believed that Strang was an actual prophet, seer, revealer, and king, and you didn't, and you told people that, it's not against the law, but if everyone else believes that, they're not going to be nice to you, right? And so I think, again, the Strang probably did stuff, but it wasn't institutionalized in that way. It was more of a result of kind of collective decisions. Again, I think it probably functioned democratically in terms of like within Strangites. The other thing we know about, and this will sort of come down to the killing, is that there are a bunch of people who converted but didn't actually convert. Typically folks wanted to marry Strangites, but they're like, I'm a Strangite now, and they didn't really go to church. And that was relatively common too.
Could you, I have no sense of what was the percentage of non-Mormon people on the island at the time?
I don't know. My sense, and maybe you might have seen this better than I is that it was mostly Mormon. That there was not a huge population immediately before they arrived. There were Native Americans who had like at least fished here for a long time, and at least came to trade and sell fish. But it's not clear that they like lived here for long. But this is the Mormons that if you were on Beaver Island, you'd be like, this is a Mormon place. And that I think some of the non-Mormons were like, oh, this is weird and chose to leave. Yeah.
And have you seen any kind of documentation on? I mean, there's disputes on the island with people as far as the census and how many Mormons are actually here. You know, and I probably without a strong basis would think it would be a gradualist thing that when Strang originally came, he didn't come with 2,000 people. He came with a handful, and then he was always sending people off to convert to New York and to try to draw people to the island. And the small population of Irish and other traders that were here eventually were kind of overwhelmed, but not initially.
Yeah, I know that it was gradual. I know that there was initially a surge. Like, it wasn't just Strang. He sort of came, wherever he went, he sort of went with a posse. And that, again, this sounds like the sort of like whitewash thing you say when it's not actually true. It does sound like there are a lot of people who were like, whoa, there are a lot of Mormons here, this is weird, and chose to leave. And there wasn't necessarily conflict. The reason why I think that most folks chose to leave is because the Strangites would write a ton about conflicts with folks over on Mackinac Island, which is close but not that close. And when they wanted to steal stuff, they would go to Mackinac Island to like, you know, try and sort of cause a ruckus. And there's not a lot from the Strangites on conflicts with folks on Beaver Island. I think they would have written it. Again, this is me speculating. The Strangites really liked the idea, and you see this a lot in sort of actually the papers that Strang published right here. The Strangites really liked the idea that Gentiles, that non-Mormons, hated them. Because they would always get into stuff with Brigham Young where he'd be like, actually, like, the folks around you like you too much for you to be actually Mormon. And so he would like, they were just looking for any possible example of I'm being persecuted, which again is kind of ironic because he was then like actually murdered. But like they really liked the idea of non-Mormons attacking them sort of fitting into their story. And so I kind of think that like the case of like a non-Mormon tries to like do some stuff on Beaver Island and then we win, that would have been real. That would have been key to Strang propaganda. And I think like if they had that source material, they would have probably run with it.
That would fit with the idea that Strang saw political advantage to make non-Mormon Gentiles uncomfortable in various ways, because maybe he really wanted them to leave.
I mean, I think like, you know, if you were on this island right now and a large Mormon sect came in and they said we have our king, like this is our king here and he's in charge, like you wouldn't be comfortable, right? There's no path to them being like, oh great, like this is awesome. Like we hate Mormons generally, but you guys who are coming with your king and saying you're ruling over the island, like love you, we're fine, like you're treating us really well. So I think some of that was inevitable. It's always hard for me to tell what's sort of political and what's like are they stealing the fish to piss people off, or are they stealing the fish because they want to eat fish? And probably the answer is like a little bit of both. Yeah.
But you also have to bear in mind they're coming from a culture that has lived on persecution. The Mormons were driven out of Ohio, they're driven out of Missouri, they're driven out of Illinois. So, you know, they have this persecution complex justifiably.
Yeah, and I think they saw, like, the in particular, the idea, I think it's also almost a thing where, like, and we see this in US politics too, right? Where it's like, if the thing you're worried about is Young versus Strang, right? And you don't want people to think about that, and you want people to think you're in charge, you say, well, people from the outside are attacking us. Like, because then there's not time to do that debate, right? Like, that is kind of the sort of trick that they're often going to pull. And I have to sort of stick around for a little bit, and I guess in our last few minutes, happy to sort of talk through the killing, because I feel like that is sort of a part of the Beaver Island history that we don't always dig into. And then sort of what happened afterwards. So Thomas Bedford was the dude who killed James Strang. A lot of debates about Bedford. I managed to find both some sources from Strang's family, from folks who want to be Island, and then an article that was written based off an interview with Bedford about 25 years later. Bedford lived on Beaver Island before Strang, so it was sort of around. As far as I know, I saw a source that said that he was one of only 3 white families who lived on the island before Strang was there. I thought, well, that's what he said, so I think that could be true. Who knows? Didn't really know what to think of Strang. Was not like I'm all in, but was kind of like I'm here. Like I'm on Beaver Island, I'm doing my thing, I don't really want to leave. And then sort of assimilated. Like he lived with the Mormons, he wasn't like I'm really Mormon. But he was sort of there, and he wasn't like fighting them. Fell in love with this girl named Ruth Ann Miller, who was the daughter of one of Strang's like kind of top lieutenants. Converted, I think converted to Mormonism kind of under some pressure from her, where she was like, hey, like, this is what you do, and he was like, you're cool, and I don't really care, so made that happen. Thomas Bedford claims that he killed Strang because in one of Strang's speeches, he said, every woman on the island needs to wear the bloomer style of dress, and if that doesn't happen, like, bad stuff goes along. Bedford says that he was like kind of a feminist, and that he and his wife were like, we're not wearing bloomers, and that his wife wasn't, or the wife was like, the wife's not going to wear bloomers, so they found like bloomers looked a little bit silly. And that the wife wasn't punished because she was the daughter of a senior leader, but that he was whipped by Strang. And that's why he chose to kill him, because that was kind of the final straw. The thing that the Bedford doesn't mention, and that doesn't often sort of get, like, is not often part of the history, is that it seems very clear that while he was living on Beaver Island, he cheated on his wife and slept with the other woman who was here. And that he was caught, and that because, partly because adultery is like not great if you're a Mormon, but also partly because there was a little bit of tension of like, you're the student of Beaver Island, are you actually converting to become a Mormon, or are you kind of just here for like fun, and you're not only going to marry this daughter of a very senior leader in our church, but you're going to cheat on her. That made the Mormons pretty upset. That, the thing that sort of Bedford says after that was that Strang is a member of the Order of the Illuminati, who are sort of the senior people, who were kind of named that because it seemed like fancy and scary, who told him, come to the printing office, like come right here. He got confronted by a group of Mormons. He saw shadows of their faces because the lights were off, but he recognized them still because they were sort of members of his inner circle. They surrounded him, they say follow, they don't say anything. They go to the post office, they bent him over and they beat him 39 times with a long stick. And then that Strang came to him next morning, says, were you whipped tonight? And then Bedford says, you know I was, for there's none of this deviltry done unless you give the orders for it, but I want you to understand that you have licked a full-blooded Englishman this time. And then they never talked again. So who knows why he killed him. I think it does also seem like if you are Bedford, like you're already a little bit miffed, people are coming to your territory, and so if someone whips you, like that's true. I think that it also seems to me that, you know, I think if someone is getting punished, and because they're trying for not like whipping folks on the daily, so it seems like if someone is getting punished in that way, I don't know that Strang gave the order. My guess is what happened was that because like it was this dude's daughter, right? It was the senior leader's daughter, and his friends were the ones who actually hit him. So like my hunch is that it came there, but I don't think Strang was shocked. Like I don't think Strang came in and be like, oh no, this is the thing that we're not allowed to do. We have evidence that year, in 1855, right before he died, he also brought the whole community together for a special conference, unrelated to Bedford, and was like, I want you to know that like we're getting too complacent, that both the Brighamites and the Native Michiganders, which again he was not talking about the Brighamites that much, were going to come for us, and that like the people here had sort of begun to stray from God, and that like things were about to happen that would like be the result of that punishment. Told everyone to be around that they felt like they were ignorant, that he didn't that they thought that he didn't notice that they'd begun to betray him, but he felt like God would notice and there'd be a reckoning for all of them. And then said, like just before he let the whole crowd go, the law of God should be kept on this land, or men shall walk over my dead body. And then was killed a few months later. So there was some drama going down on the island. USS Michigan, which had sort of long come and harassed Strang, again, over stealing fish, over being a Mormon, over like lots of drama, over some tax disputes. The same ship that had come and sort of pointed a gun at his judge and brought Strang to this trial, they pull up to Beaver Island. By that time, he had knew the captain of the ship. They were about the same age. They had like talked before, and I think for Strang, they weren't friends, but that like for Strang, the idea that the captain of this very big ship was sailing to his island, kind of greeting him as king, and saying, hey, let's fight. Like there was sort of nothing that fit more into the Strangite narrative than that. And I think the captain of the ship probably, to some extent, maybe understood that like, I'm not saying they were besties, but like there was some kind of, it sort of worked for both of them, that like the captain was able to kind of fight this war against like these crazy Mormons living on this island, and for Strang it was like, take that, bring him down. Like you know how many ships coming up to you, pointing their guns at you and saying, let's fight. Captain of the ship is that the captain goes to Strang's house. They sort of talk. They say, the captain says, do you want to come on my ship with me and we can talk some more? Strang puts on his sort of full regal stuff, like his crown and I think the scepter, and he has sort of a robe that looks like a king. Strang is not afraid, says, sure, I'll come with you. Probably could have gotten away with not coming. And as they're walking across the island, Bedford and this guy named Thomas Wentworth, who was sort of a co-conspirator, was also upset with Strang, crept under a porch near the pier, looked at the Michigan, or sort of, they saw that Strang and McBlair, the captain, were kind of walking, and they were joking, and they were telling stories as he was boarding the ship, and pulled out a gun and shot them on the dock. Strang survived for 27 days. Went off on the mainland. I think, but I don't know, that it sounds like he at least was sort of with some family members. And was not like completely fine, like not completely there, but was like alive and seemed like he could have named a successor. And just didn't. Like didn't say I'm like not going to, but it just like did not happen. It did go.
Yeah, it's just a question on Wentworth. Do you have any information on him and his motivation or anything like that?
I'm not sure. So I know that there were at least 4 guys. There's McCullough, Johnson, Wentworth, and Bedford. I think there might be information on him. Like I think that like probably like it's not crazy that you're sort of upset with the kingdom, like Strang did some stuff. I'm not sure why they did it, but there could be sources I haven't seen on that. But again, I think like Strang did some stuff, right? And it was probably not shocking that people would be upset there. Then yeah, it's just Strang died on the mainland, did not name a successor. In the meantime, as Strang was dying, the USS Michigan took the 4 folks who conspired to kill Strang onto the ship because they knew that they'd be killed by the mob if they hadn't been there. They brought them over to mainland, either Michigan or Wisconsin. They were in jail briefly awaiting trial. A mob broke them out of jail, gave them alcohol and money, and held a parade for them. They were put on trial. They were convicted of murder, and 1 or 2 of them got a fine.
Wasn't that, I heard it was on Mackinac Island that happened, is that not?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't think so. I know that they went to Mackinac before they went to the mainland, but I don't know that the trial itself happened on Mackinac, although it might have. And I know that Bedford, I think, was ordered to pay $1.25 and didn't. Like didn't say that he wasn't going to do it. Strang, while he was sort of in his sort of last, like a couple weeks alive, summoned a couple of followers who I think thought that he was about to say, like, here's who's in charge, and instead said, you need to go to Beaver Island and you need to tell everyone there to leave. Because, like, now that I'm gone, now that there's some sort of disruption, like, the Gentiles are going to take the island back, and, like, if you put up a fight, like, they're going to kill you. Bedford, who was free from jail after a day, went to Green Bay, got a mob of 20 guys together, who came by wagon, who were armed, and who started to burn the town down. Worked with a guy named Newton who lived on Mackinac, tried to find all the valuables that they could see, abused the women in some way, although it's not clear what, whipped the guys, sort of plundered the temples and then burned down. They had a huge tabernacle down here, and then got on a big ship and went off to Wisconsin and settled, and the Strangites then scattered. There's a lot of drama around what happens next. Out there are still 2 Strangite churches around that hate each other. They had their own sort of second succession crisis after Strang died, where one church thinks that someone's in charge, and one church thinks that the other's in charge. But we were left with, a couple thousand people who had lived on this island, who were kicked off, who were sort of just put on, like, the shore, and they were just like, good luck trying to figure out, like, what to do next, to try to sort themselves out. Strang had multiple wives and had a lot of children, and some of those children knew him pretty well, and some of those children didn't. And so one of the sort of most interesting, I think, sources that I've found at either BYU or the Church History Library were letters from Strang's children to folks who lived in the island with Strang, where I think the ones who didn't know him were like, what happened, probably grew up in, like, somewhere in Michigan usually, and, like, had a single mom who was, like, figuring her stuff out, and, like, a lot of the Strangites were just very hesitant to talk about, like, what had actually happened there. And they would write letters to people, and they'd be like, hey, like, I heard Dad was a king on an island somewhere that I haven't been to, like, what's up with that? And so we have these really interesting sources of Strangites sort of later reflecting. One interesting source is a dude named L.D. Hickley, who was one of Strang's 12 apostles. As to why or what men may say about your father being king, etc., he was accused and then tried before the highest court in the United States and was acquitted. And treason was one of the charges. When judge heard our faith and had the lies, etc., laid before him, he told the jury that the Latter-day Saints held to this order as a preparatory work for the millennium, and that we had a scriptural and constitutional right to have a king and a kingdom. And that ended the greatest trial that has happened since Pilates' day. We have more from Hickley on the next page. Your welcome letter is in hand and duly read. I am at present engaged in discussion, and my time is well used, but I'm always glad to hear from any friends of James J. Strang. There's a kindred feeling that brings us as no one knows save those who stood together on that island July 8th, 1850, that no one knows save those to whom God and man reveals it. So that your letter calls up refreshing thoughts and happy feelings on the one hand and sad ones on the other. Yes, I have had a little experience in the Mormon school. As you refer to what I know, I stood with your kind and generous father when he was torn from his home and taken to Detroit and tried before Judge Wilkinson for treason and other charges. I've seen the days of hell when they wanted to burn him at the stake or do anything only to get him dead. They took a horse thief out of jail and fetched him in court and told him that if he would swear to certain things against Strang, they would let him go. This is only a drop of what your father passed through. We have more letters down the line from Sarah Wright Strang Wing, who was one of Strang's wives. I think this was to a historian or a biographer. Again, if you have the paper, you can read a little bit more of it. But getting her sense, talked about coming to Beaver Island. Now when I talked to my father about marrying James Strang, he did not forbid me, but said, my daughter, I would almost as leave see you buried in the marry into polygamy. I'm afraid you will not be happy, but I took the chance. I thought he was the Lord's chosen prophet and all would be right. So writes about him being mild-spoken and kind. Says that, I think either in here or later, that the killers were not whipped before that. That Strang had a wife who she didn't know before Beaver Island. Of course, I did not believe all I heard. I had faith that James was a prophet of God and would do no wrong. I don't believe that today. I don't believe today that God ever speaks to any man. I think we should do as near right as we know and be loyal to our government. My father was a conscientious man when he joined the Latter-day Saints Church, but in those days people were superstitious. I think the word is superstitious than today. But when the Lord has done nothing for our church in 63 or 64 years, we think differently. And finally, we have a letter from his daughter, Jenny Phillips, when a follower asked him, like, why didn't your dad name a successor? Although the father may have seemed to some to have failed in his duty to the people and not appointing someone in his place, yet in my opinion he was wise. I do not believe under the conditions that he could have succeeded. It seems to me that they were saved another unhappy and unsuccessful experiment. However, none of us are wise enough to know what would have been the result. At least we must give him credit for doing what in his wisdom seems best for all concerned, and I believe he knew more about the matter than anyone else. That's what we have. I mean, there are still Strangites around. They're kind of doing their thing. There are not a lot of them. Not all of them are descendants. Some of them are kind of just there. But they were wiped out. And I think, we can tell the story of this kind of kooky, weird cult that wound up in Michigan and that petered out because Strang was strange. Which, maybe there are elements of truth too. But it's also worth remembering that, the reason why there are no longer Strangites on this island, and the reason why, not just the reason why Strang was killed, but the reason why the Strangites knew they wouldn't be safe to stay, was because the government protected people who killed Mormons. And because they knew that, if they had hung out there while that mob had burned down their temples, they would have been killed too. And so as we think about the rest of Beaver Island history, all the great and exciting things that happened here, the reason why there are not, 200 or 150, some number of Mormon families still hanging out here is because there's a kind of nasty history to this place that it seems like we don't always reckon with. Because when we look at religions, I'm not a Mormon, right? There are things in the Mormon church that I disagree with, but when we look at religions that make us feel uncomfortable or make us feel weird, we kind of turn a blind eye to anything bad that happens to them. So I hope that was a chance to kind of dig a little bit deeper into Strang, see some of the sort of humanity of the island, and also think a little bit deeper around, why there are no longer Strangites here. That is kind of the last of this, but I'm happy to hang out if folks have questions or just want to talk one-on-one.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk. We'd like to invite, speakers in and hear their interpretations of history. And we will have another Strang talk during Museum Week. Author Miles Harvey is going to come to the island. It'll be his first live presentation since that whole skip year ended. And he wrote The King of Confidence, which we do have copies of that book in here. And I also have some copies of Forgotten Kingdom by Lori Lounsbury, who just signed them this morning. So I have signed copies available if you'd like to purchase a copy of that too. Her book is historical fiction.
Lori, do you know where the tabernacle was?
Well, no. Font Lake-ish. I really don't know the location.
It'd be interesting to identify what Mormon buildings are still remaining. Of course, so many of them, I'm sure, got recycled into other buildings.
Yeah, I know that there has been some imaging done, and hopefully they'll be able to identify some cultural spots on the island, but nobody's really said exactly sure. Do you know for sure? I have never had anybody say this is exactly where it's
I'm not going to speculate because it's private property now and shouldn't be accessed.
And all I know is that, I don't know about, my hunch is that, I think there are cabins. In terms of, the religious buildings, the tabernacle and Strang's home, because they burned, the Mormons, built almost all their stuff entirely with wood, because they didn't, getting metal to be around was hard. And because the Mormons were still there while they burned it down, the mob kind of made a show of taking the important places and, really burning them down. And the kind of valuable stuff, like the metal and the gold and the kind of artifacts, they knew they could sell that later. And so my hunch is, I was very interested in that, but my hunch is that the interesting stuff is very completely gone.
But this was Mormon built. You can see 12-inch by 12-inch logs there that will have a display. This part of the building is going to be remodeled this year. That's why it's closed when this museum is open. Over here, we're going to have new flooring, new ceilings on both levels, and new electricity and either heat or air conditioning from that building into here. So it's
It'll be
time
the
for
first
refreshing.
time in 170 some years that this will be environmentally controlled.
Those walls that you're standing against will be removed to help with the displays and exhibits. Those are not original walls, so we have permission to remove them.
Very nice, thank you, Mike.
Yes, once again, thank you for coming. You may tour the museum if you'd like. I'll leave it open just a little while longer if you haven't had an opportunity to browse over there.